Climate change today and its impacts are very much evident and real. It is growing to become a serious concern. So, firstly, what are the impacts of climate change on our country?
Many people argue differently, but the vast majority, as we know, the scientific opinion is that climate change is real. It has profound and potentially grievous consequences to our livelihoods, lives, and the whole global environment. There's no question about it. And already, anybody who is following the news in North America in the last few days, I never heard of a bomb cyclone until that time, or minus 45 degrees Celsius in places like Montana, for instance, or Minneapolis, and so on and so forth, Minnesota, etc. We can see it's real. World over, the gravity of the climate changes, the weather changes, the cyclones, floods, heavy rainfall, you can see the intensity increasing dramatically. Records are being set month after month, year after year. India may be slightly better off, at least for the time being. It appears that the rainfall will increase without any grave consequences in terms of the temperatures otherwise. But that's a local thing. I don't know how long it will last. But in general, it's clear that climate change is here. And therefore, we have to adapt to that. We have to do our best to try and minimize the temperature increase. And we have to also learn to adapt it, because already it's late. Even if we now stop further CO2 emissions, already I think we are about 1% or 1.5% above the average in the earlier era. And in India, you see three patterns. One, monsoons have become heavier but more erratic. Sometimes delayed monsoons, sometimes early monsoons. Overall rainfall may increase, but uneven rainfall, etc., etc. As a consequence, tremendous flooding and damage to not only crops, but urban environment, households. And Pakistan has seen perhaps some of the gravest floods in recent times. This year, Pakistan's flooding was incredible. 10 years ago, they had similar flooding in Pakistan. 2010 or 2011, they had again similar flooding there. Impact in the whole country. And Pakistan is not a small country. It's a fairly large country, one of the 10 large countries of the world. So already we see the impact of that, of this unseasonal rainfall, uneven rainfall, and so on and so forth. And three, our agriculture and our cities are particularly going to be affected, because even if rainfall remains somewhat same or more, the unevenness or the untimeliness of the rains means that we have to now work out the seasons, agricultural seasons again. We have to understand what's happening, and the whole science and technology, agricultural practices, the agricultural seasons, they all must now respond to the climate change, because climate will not respond to your concerns. You have to now adjust to the climate. Urban, with increasing urbanization, we are still only at 30% urbanization, remember. It's going to be 60, 70%. That's part of modernization. Actually, India has the lowest level of urbanization for a large economy in the world. And this is going to grow dramatically. And therefore, the problem is going to be aggravated for the urban poor. And unless we really build the right kind of infrastructure and institutional mechanisms to manage the vagaries of nature, it will lead to tremendous amount of loss of life and suffering all over, particularly in cities.
While we talk about climate change, it is also important to highlight the governance and infrastructural aspects of it. So how has climate change affected different tiers in the country, that is in cities, in small towns, and in villages differently?
No, I entirely agree with you. See, sometimes I think we are taking shelter under the general expression of climate change, ignoring what we have to do. Nature has never told us that there will be even rainfall every year or within a year every day. Nature has never told us that there will not be any cyclones or storms or something. We are now pretending horror and all sorts of things and blaming climate change instead of strengthening our capacity to resist the nature's vagaries. What is human civilization? Humanity is different from any other species because we learned collectively how to combat the vagaries of nature up to a point. Beyond a point, we probably cannot. So unlike other animals, however cold it is, we learn to be warm. However hot it is, we learn to be cool. However dry it is, we learn to harness water. However rainy it is, we learn to keep ourselves dry. Now that is civilization. Now suddenly pretending that climate change is the reason why our cities are getting flooded, our agricultural lands are getting inundated during a cyclonic rain or something is, in my judgment, not only unproductive and wasteful because you can't complain against nature, that's no use, it's also artful and disingenuous. Our failings, we are trying to simply put it under the column of climate change. Our stormwater drainage is a disaster in our cities because we simply blocked all the natural courses. After when it rains, rainwater must flow into the lower reaches, then go into streams and then rivers and then finally into the sea. If you block it, then you complain that there is flooding. Whose problem is that? Did nature ever tell you that water will flow upwards? Water will only flow downwards. World over in urban environments, even 300-400 years ago, cities like Paris, London, etc., what did they do? They did contour surveys. And they made sure that their roads, their water supply lines, their sewers, and stormwater drains are according to the contours. They followed natural contours. And therefore, unless there's an extraordinarily mega event which is not within human control, you rarely see a major disruption to life just because of a bit of a rainfall or something. Whereas a 50 millimeters rainfall, suddenly, even in front of a chief minister's house, there is flooding in the streets. So this is not about climate change. This is about an inadequacy in urban management. Similarly, rural areas. For even a man like Sir Arthur Cotton, 150, 160 years ago, in this part of the country, in Andhra Pradesh, when they built barrages over Godavari and Krishna and so on and so forth, he took advantage of the natural natural streams and minor rivers, converted them into natural drains. Because he understood that providing water is one thing, but removing the surplus water from the fields is equally important. So there is a canal system providing irrigation, there is a drainage system which is taking away surplus water and then draining it to the sea. What did we do? We allowed the silt to accumulate, we allowed the weeds to grow, impeding the flow, and we encroached on this land out of our greed to put a little more land to agriculture. Net result is, even a limited rainfall leading to tremendous devastation, hundreds of thousands of acres of land is inundated. Then we say there's a natural calamity, we have to do something about it. And we are not even today improving these drains. For instance, with my own effort, initiative, Dr. Channa Reddy, the Chief Minister in Andhra Pradesh at that time, took up with the World Bank and came up with the World Bank project for reconstruction of the irrigation and drainage system in Krishna and Godavari deltas. It was hugely successful 30 years ago. All right, we didn't do it before that, after independence. But after that, in the past 30 years, we never again did it. At least if every 10 years we rejuvenate our canal system and our drainage system, then a bit of a rainfall, unless it's extraordinarily heavy, will not affect our agriculture. We have seen it once before. We don't do it. And the next flood happens like in Pakistan, we then lament and browbeat and chest thump and blame climate failure or God. So there's a lot we need to do and we can do. And it is about governance. And city management, for instance, one is, as we said, contour surveys and making sure that the people do not inhabit areas which are prone to inundation, because if you put people in low-lying areas, there will be flooding inevitably. But the other thing is, in a country like India, unless there is local urbanization as much as possible, if everybody is forced to go to a big city, distant big city, to eke out a precarious livelihood, if the poorest in cities, what kind of a support system do they have? There's no social support. They have no housing. If they are in distress of some kind or other, there's nobody to help them. They have to commute 15-20 kilometers to go to work. Go back again the same distance, wherever they are for the time being staying. As I said, there's no housing. There are no basic amenities. It's a terrible life. Urban poverty is becoming much more cruel and much more unbearable than rural poverty. For a long time in India, after independence, we talked about rural poverty. Today, the real challenge is not rural poverty, it's urban poverty. And it's largely because of unchecked urban migration. Not that it should be controlled, because you're forcing the poorest people without skills to migrate to big cities without any social support system. A, if you create social support system in the cities, and B, if you don't force them to migrate to distant cities and create living conditions and opportunities relatively locally in small towns, then much of this can be mitigated. So all this is a matter of governance and competence in terms of managing the impact of climate change. And India is very inadequate at this stage, but we are still in early stages. Therefore, even now, if we wake up, we can mitigate the climate change impact.
I have a follow-up question. In terms of climate change management or adoption, as the local government know about the population of its local environment, like demographic dimension, if in a aspect of crisis, which population to be prioritized, because it know the demographic dividends, whether the high population people are living or the youngsters are living, one, and it also knows the topography of the region. So is it not that high time to empower the local government so that the local government able to handle or manage the crisis at the local level?
You are absolutely right. Even when there was no democracy, what did the British do? They made the district magistrate the fulcrum of all these efforts in emergencies. The district magistrate is one functionary in the country who could never pass the buck in an emergency, in a crisis. All responsibility rests in that. And therefore, all authority also converges if necessary. And the full powers of coordination are there. Extraordinary powers of Treasury Rule 27, it's called in the Madras Presidency, for instance, are given. Without the legislature authorizing expenditure, the district magistrate is empowered to draw money and subsequently account for it. These are extraordinary powers. That means even the British colonial government also understood the importance of local decision making and responsive administration. Now, in post-independence era, we should have naturally democratized that. While this is local and responsive, a district magistrate is not a democratized institution. It is an imposition by the larger entity, the state and the nation. And democracy meant we should have empowered the people with the same framework of local coordination, local responsibility, local responsiveness. We failed to do so. So even today, we depend on the district magistrate. And without the people's participation and the legitimacy of the people's mandate, and without the knowledge that comes from understanding of the local topography and the local population, you can never be effective beyond a point. You can probably save some lives and you can have overall coordination, but that is the same as 100 years ago. You're not better off. Whereas if actually you empower the local government effectively, but ensure that they are adequately supported with technical support and where required infrastructure and logistics, then you get the best out of the system. So even our own experience, let alone other countries' experience, shows that localization is important. That's why I was not a great supporter of the National Disaster Management Authority. We don't require it. All you require is a national framework to provide technology and resources and some equipment or some procurement where it cannot be locally procured in case of very large catastrophes. Otherwise, we have a robust system. Democratize it, don't centralize it. Whereas in India, we move towards centralization of the existing system, we never move towards democratization of it.